Let's be real, the founding fathers didn't get everything right, but one thing they did recognize, probably because they just spent years fighting a government that tried to silence them, was that people need the power to hold their own beliefs, speak up, and voice their grievances without fear of retaliation. Which is why it should come as no surprise that the Constitution's First Amendment was about exactly that. A 45-word powerhouse, the First Amendment was designed to protect your voice, your beliefs, and your right to protest, among other things. What even is the First Amendment? What does it actually say? Why should you care? And how is it relevant today? In this video, we're breaking it down. Let's read the actual text together. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Old-timey legal jargon aside, you may have heard some very familiar keywords in there. These are the 5 freedoms secured by the First Amendment. The freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom to assemble, and the freedom to petition. Now, when most people hear First Amendment, they might think freedom of speech, and they're not wrong, but that's not all the First Amendment protects. Speech is just one part of it. Let's take a quick look at all 5. Let's start with the freedom of speech. Simply put, freedom of speech means you can express your thoughts and your opinions without the government punishing you for it. There are limitations to this, but we'll talk more about it next week. Freedom of the press protects journalists and media outlets, allowing them to investigate, criticize, and report on the government without fear of censorship or retaliation. Freedom of religion allows anyone to practice any faith or no faith at all without interference from the government. Freedom of assembly means that we can gather publicly in groups to protest, advocate for change, or even simply to celebrate. And finally, the freedom to petition the government means you can demand solutions when things aren't working, whether that's through lawsuits, protests, or yes, even angry phone calls, tweets, and emails to your elected officials. These rights weren't just thrown together at random. They all share a common purpose: to protect dissent, to enable debate, and to allow people to hold powerful institutions accountable. To put it simply, the First Amendment exists so democracy can actually work. So, where did all this come from? Let's hear from my colleague Harrison to learn more.
To better understand why the First Amendment was created, we should go back to 1791. The Constitution had just been written. It laid out what the structure of our government and what each branch can do, but it didn't provide protections for individuals and their rights. There was an obvious need for there to be a document that clearly outlined these protections. That's where the Bill of Rights comes in. Anyone who is currently on US soil, whether a state, territory, or protectorate, has the full protection of the Bill of Rights, not just US citizens. They encompass the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. That's why the ACLU of Arizona often references certain amendments when talking about our constitutionally protected rights. The First Amendment wasn't first by accident. Only 8 years removed from the American Revolution, the founders witnessed firsthand how dangerous and oppressive a government could be when it could silence critics, control religion, and punish speech. So they wrote these protections with the idea that the government should never be able to control your conscience, your beliefs, or your voice. Now, let's clear up a big misconception. The First Amendment protects you from government interference. That's it. It doesn't stop a private employer from firing an employee for something they said online. It won't stop a private university from disciplining a student for violating their conduct policies. And it certainly doesn't prevent tech companies from picking and choosing who gets to say what on their social media platform. But it does mean that the government, your local police department, your public high school principal, or even your city council can't punish you just for speaking your mind, reporting on their actions, practicing your religion, or organizing peacefully.
Thank you, Harrison. So what happens when the government oversteps? That's where the American Civil Liberties Union and your local ACLU of Arizona comes in. For over a century, we have worked to defend the rights guaranteed under the First Amendment, especially for people in communities who face the most targeted attacks. We have long fought for the right of students to protest, of journalists to report, and of the LGBTQ+ community to express themselves freely. The freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment aren't just abstract principles. They're tools people can use every single day to speak out against injustice, to ask hard questions, and to demand change. For example, did you know the Supreme Court once had to decide whether students could wear black armbands to school to protest the Vietnam War? The court definitively decided that they could. That case was Tinker versus Des Moines, and it's one of the most famous free speech cases in American history. Of course, none of these freedoms are absolute. For example, you can't incite imminent violence and claim it is protected under the First Amendment. We'll take a deep dive into into more of that in the next few videos. We'll also take a look at how the First Amendment is showing up in the news today. Each video in this series will include examples to provide a window into how the First Amendment actually works in real life. And that's what the series is all about. Understanding your rights and freedoms doesn't just help you recognize when something's wrong. It empowers you and your community to do something about it. So next time someone mentions the First Amendment like it's a blanket magic shield, you'll have a better understanding of what rights you have related to it. In our next episode, we'll zoom in on the amendment that gets the most headlines, the freedom of speech. What kinds of speech are protected? What isn't? And what happens when students, activists, and everyday people across the political spectrum test the limits? Until then, remember, you have rights. Make sure you know them.